Dinner was to be at 8, and in the soft lull between unveiling and procession to the dining room, the company drifted into small eddies of talk that revealed more by their currents than by their words. Lamps had been turned a shade lower. The portrait, like a pale moon, presided. Pemberton replenished champagne with unhurried precision. He had that gift of servants in old houses, to melt and reappear as if by thought rather than footfall. When Miss Thornbury's glass tilted, he steadied it with a glance that was almost paternal. "You must allow me," murmured Peregrine Hartwell to Vivian, who had paused before the canvas, her face almost an echo of its painted calm. "The mouth," he gestured delicately, "is a fraction softer in the underdrawing. I left it in the end. A kindness to reality." "It is very honest," Vivian said, and there was no reproach in it. "I suppose I had hoped art might be kinder than life." Richard, lingering with the air of a man proprietorially considering a purchase, smiled. "Art's task is not to coddle us, surely. If it flatters, it does so in a higher register." "Perhaps," Hartwell replied, "but flattery and pity are second cousins, and I prefer neither." Lady Constance's fan, a mother-of-pearl trifle held as a symbol rather than a necessity, clicked once. "We will not descend into aesthetics," she said, managing warmth as one might manage a household budget. "We shall have 3 courses and a syllabub, and Mr. Hartwell will sit by me and talk about Venice, which is always safe." Daphne Thornbury had made a small foray to the French windows and now returned with a slip of cool air about her shoulders. "There's mist on the lawn," she said brightly. "As if the house were floating. Silly, isn't it?" "Not silly," said Alleyn, who had moved unassumingly to the mantel, examining nothing in particular. "Houses do float sometimes. On memory." He set his glass down and, with the tact of a guest who has learned to read rooms as other men read newspapers, addressed Lady Constance. "I've rarely seen a butler capable of arranging a tray as if it were a sentence in Latin. Pemberton, permit me, has syntax." Lady Constance thawed a fraction. "He has a sense of place, Inspector. The same cannot be said of all of us." It was lightly spoken, but Alleyn, who was a connoisseur of tone, noted Richard's fractional stiffening and the painter's attentive stillness. Vivian's hand moved to her bracelet again, a tiny jangling, like the memory of rain. The clasp, Alleyn observed from the corner of an eye, had been bent and carefully reshaped. Not new, not old. Something between. "Your telephone call," Vivian said to Richard, as if seeking the safety of the ordinary. "Was it about the Paris quotations?" "Nothing to trouble you," he answered, looking at her with a correctness that was affectionate by habit. "A minor flurry in town. We ride little tempests from time to time." "Richard rides them admirably," Lady Constance added. "It is a quality I value in a husband for my daughter almost as much as punctuality." "Punctuality," said Hartwell, "is the virtue of men who do not trust time." "Then I am a paragon," Richard returned, and there was a thread of steel beneath the silk. He raised his glass toward the portrait. "To Miss Bellwether, and to the unflinching art that will keep her as she is this evening for as long as canvas endures." Daphne sipped too quickly and coughed, a small sound quickly buried under compliment. "I remember when we built play weddings out of lawn chairs and bedspreads," she said to Vivian, eyes bright. "We'd draft Pemberton as a bishop and make my terrier ring the bell." Master Henry objected to the bell, Pemberton observed, invited into the conversation by his own discretion. He preferred the whistle. The bell he found theological. "Henry always objected," Lady Constance said, the fan again. "It was his charm." "Where is Henry this evening?" Alleyn asked with casual interest. "In Scotland," said Richard, and the answer came too quickly. "Stalking. He's never been a friend to ceremonies." Alleyn let it pass. The lilies breathed their pale perfume. A draught from the half-open doors stirred the ivory drape, now folded across a chair. On the carpet by the easel lay a smudge of ultramarine, a thumb's worth, where Hartwell's cuff had brushed. He noticed the artist's hand, long, paint-roughened, the nails clean, rest briefly and intimately on the easel's worn edge as one touches the shoulder of a companion. "Dinner is served, my lady," said Pemberton from the doorway with the unhurried finality that moves evenings forward in houses like these. There was the small, customary reshuffle. Lady Constance on Richard's arm, Hartwell paired as commanded, Daphne falling into step beside Vivian. Alleyn, as a late and anomalous guest, drifted to the rear. He paused a fraction and looked back. In that second, the portrait seemed to shift its gaze past him to the door, as if listening. It was nonsense, yet he had learned not to quarrel with nonsense until it had had a chance to become a fact. The party passed out, their voices lowering to the pitch of silver and candlelight. The drawing-room, left to flowers and paint and the held breath of great houses, received the mist from the lawn and kept its counsel. Alleyn stood a moment within the chapel and allowed the place to tell him its story. It was not a talkative room. The small Ashworth chapel had the compressed stillness of a jewel box. Old stone polished by centuries of discreet devotion, a faint fragrance of beeswax from the pews, lilies standing up white and proper upon the altar. The dusk, which elsewhere softened edges, here seemed to refine them. Vivienne lay where a bride would kneel to receive a blessing, and the irony was so delicate as to seem intentional. He did not approach at once. He noticed, rather, the small things that had not troubled themselves to be dramatic. The stained glass panels, St. Catherine and St. Cecilia, threw faint shards of color upon the flags. One narrow window stood parted a fraction, admitting a thread of cool air that played upon a loose yellow strand of hair at Vivian's temple. The forget-me-nots in her hands were fresh. Their stems left a small, clear droplet on the stone as if they had only just ceased to weep. "Pemberton," Alleyn said quietly, "you will be so good as to keep the drawing-room intact. No one in, no one out. Have the local doctor sent for who attends the family." "Dr. Penhaligon, sir." Pemberton's voice was carefully level. "He lives at the village, 5 minutes by motor. I shall telephone at once." "And perhaps the vicar could be asked to make himself available," Alleyn added, not because he needed a parson, but because parsons, like butlers, knew the timetables of other people's hearts. Pemberton bowed and moved away on soundless feet. Alleyn went to the threshold of the chancel. Richard had not moved far from the doorway and looked, in that moment, like a man who had been deprived of the use of his spectacles, though they sat upon his nose. Lady Constance was composed by brute habit, her lips a single thread. Daphne Thornberry had followed to the corridor and stood there as if asking permission to breathe. "If you please," Alleyn said, very gently, "let us remain in the passage. We shall have light brought." He passed within. He noted the absence of disorder, no cloth rucked beneath Vivian's shoulder, no bruise upon the perfect oval of her temple. Her lashes lay in a pale fringe. He stooped without touching and observed her mouth. No foam, no contortion. There was, however, that insinuating sweetness in the air, traced from her to the altar rail and back again, as elusive as a remembered tune. Almond said an old corner of his mind, but he offered the thought no words. Near her shoulder, a single pinhead of something glittered. No, not glittered, merely refused the stone's dullness. He marked it with his eye, a fragment of blue enamel, perhaps, lying near an infinitesimal scratch on the flag. He straightened and looked about him as a man looks at a page he has read and means to read again. The altar vessels, silver, very old, stood in their customary places, the fair linen flawlessly aligned. A prayer book lay open at the rail, Psalm 27, the page turn recent enough that the ribbon had not yet settled. He saw the sacristy door, its key still in the lock, the brass bright with frequent polishing. The door stood closed. A draught crept from beneath it, and with it a faint odour of wax mingled with that other sweetness. When Dr. Penhaligon arrived, a brisk and respectful, Alleyn yielded the central space without fuss. The examination, as far as propriety and minimal disturbance allowed, took its course. "Peaceful," the doctor murmured at last, troubled. "No sign of struggle. One might suppose, well, a collapse. But that scent. You notice it?" "One notices many things," Alleyn replied. "You will be so good as to make arrangements with the county authorities for an examination at the earliest possible moment." It was neither an order nor a request. It was the courteous assumption of a partnership. He returned to the passage and, with the tact of a man who has done this too often to require emphasis, guided Lady Constance back toward the drawing-room. "May I suggest, Lady Constance, that we keep everyone together? It will save you the fatigue of repeated explanations." "Quite," she said. "Quite." As they approached, Alleyn saw the painter, Hartwell, standing a little apart, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. The right thumb bore a faint smudge of Prussian blue, and a line of paint traced along the cuff of his coat like an accident a valet would notice in despair. His expression, when he looked up, was not theatrical grief, but the artist's abstracted sorrow at a composition cruelly altered. Miss Thornbury, brought into the light, had recovered sufficient composure to speak. "Inspector, Vivian often came to the chapel when she was thoughtful. It was not unusual." "Thank you," said Alleyn. He took it as he took the fact that the forget-me-nots had been gathered very recently from damp ground, and that Vivian's bracelet, the little enamelled thing he had seen her turn in her fingers, was not about her wrist now. He allowed silence to do what questions would have done clumsily. In that silence, the room shifted and settled. People remembered where their eyes had been and corrected them. Richard removed his spectacles and polished them with care upon a linen square, an action so practiced that it seemed an occupation rather than a necessity. Lady Constance rang for tea as if the gesture might summon back the world that had so rashly departed. "Mr. Pemberton has telephoned the doctor and the vicar," Pemberton himself announced from the doorway, unflurried. "I have also had the dining room held." "Thank you," Alleyn said. "If the household would be so kind as to assemble here, we shall presently want to know the small things, who went where, and when, and by which door." "Not yet. For the moment, let us sit." They sat, obedient to custom rather than instruction. Alleyn took a place a little to one side, where he could observe them arranged like sitters in a group portrait. The painter with his unfathomable eyes, the friend with her hands clenched white on the arm of her chair, the bridegroom polished to a dull, stricken shine, and at the apex, the mistress of the house, stiff against the collapse of form. He said very little. He watched the spaces between their words, the trifling inaccuracies of their recollections, the tiny betrayals of glance and hand. The chapel would keep its counsel for an hour, the living less so. Presently, he would begin to ask. For now, he merely listened, and the case began to form in him as quietly as mist over the river at dawn. It was agreed, without discussion, that the library would serve. The room had the dignity of oak and leather, the comfort of a fire half-banked and steady on its duties, and the quiet that allowed words to fall clearly when they must, and to evaporate when they should not. Lady Constance took the nearest chair and held it like a small citadel. Richard stood at the mantelpiece, glasses unusually dark in the lamplight. Miss Thornbury occupied a low stool as if her childhood had returned to her, and Mr. Hartwell made a show of examining a shelf of antiquated travelogues. Pemberton moved soundlessly, a ghost of service with a tray of tea that no one wanted. Alleyn, with the courtesy of one who never forgets he is a guest, asked for no more than the room's permission. It was given, and he began. "Lady Constance, if you'll forgive me, I should be grateful for the sequence of the evening, after the unveiling." Lady Constance's hand strayed to her pearls. We moved toward dinner. Vivian complained of the heat. It was absurd. The evening was quite temperate. I advised a few minutes of air in the chapel corridor. It is cooler there. One hears the organ blower when the verger tests it, though not tonight. She left by the small side door. That was all. She went alone? I presume so. Daphne, Miss Thornberry, offered to accompany her. Vivian declined. Miss Thornberry's head lifted. The motion was small, but significant. She said she wanted 1 minute by herself. She used to say that at school when... She stopped, rearranged her skirt, and produced a brittle smile. It's a habit, Inspector. Hardly evidence. Habits are often the best evidence, Alleyn said, and let the remark rest between them. He turned to Richard. And you received a telephone call? Yes. Richard's tone had the correctness of a business letter. A matter from my London office. I took it in the study. Pemberton showed the caller through. Well, the operator through. It lasted 10 minutes. Perhaps 12. Did you leave the receiver to fetch Miss Bellwether? I did. When I'd finished, I went to the drawing room and then to the corridor. I saw the chapel door ajar. Alleyn allowed a breath of time. You found her as we saw her? Yes. Thank you. He did not pursue Richard's call. It would keep. He turned to Peregrine Hartwell, who had drawn a volume at random and was engaged in not reading it. Mr. Hartwell, your portrait struck me as exacting in one feature. The church door, slightly open. An artist's fancy. Hartwell replaced the book gently. Yes and no. I made a study in the chapel, earlier in the week. The light interested me, the way it pools at the threshold and refuses to proceed. Symbolism, if you like, a harmless kind that paints only what exists. You went alone? I asked Pemberton for the key. He was kind enough to oblige. Lady Constance's eyes moved, quick and involuntary, to the butler. It was a small look that crossed a salon before anyone could rise to greet it. Pemberton inclined his head, his features as correct as a menu. It is not unusual, my lady. Mr. Hartwell wished to sketch. I am accountable for the keys. Alleyn did not look at the butler, but he noted the repetition. Accountable. He let it pass for now and turned to Miss Thornberry. You have known Miss Bellwether a long while. All my life, practically, Daphne said. Too quickly. She adjusted again, a small ballet of hands and hem. She had a way of seeming very sure and very unsure at the same time. It was her charm, and sometimes a nuisance. Had you any reason to believe she would go to the chapel for more than air? Daphne looked at the hearth, as if weighing heat against truth. Vivian liked the hush there. She used to play the organ pedals when she thought no one was looking. Only throbs, not notes. It made us giggle. Tonight? I don't know. She looked at the portrait as if it had said something rude, and then she touched her bracelet. She always did that, and went out. Alleyn said very gently, the bracelet is not with her. No, said Daphne, and the quickness was gone. It's silly, but I noticed. The little blue forget-me-nots. We bought them together in Paris. We were ridiculous children. I told her she must wear diamonds if she must wear anything. She said the bracelet made her brave. Lady Constance said, it was a trinket. I told her not to wear it tomorrow. It would jar. That is all the significance it has, Inspector. Quite, Alleyn said. Trifles are often the hinges of larger doors. The clock on the mantel tapped the hour with discreet certainty. Somewhere, a door closed with the wind's assistance or its resistance. The house held its breath. Dr. Penhaligon will give me the medical truth, Alleyn said, and I shall ask the practical questions tomorrow. For tonight, only this. Was there anyone who might have reason to be jealous of Miss Bellwether or frightened of what the wedding would alter? It was the kind of question that is less a stone thrown into a pond than a hand briefly laid upon its surface. The ripples were small but readable. Lady Constance's posture took on something statuary, the composure of an older school. Richard's gaze shifted to the book's gilt titles and remained there, as if names on spines could be studied for answers. Hartwell's mouth flexed, a painter's motion as he considered a line. Daphne, at last, looked at Alleyn rather than away. "Everyone," she said, too softly for bravado. "Everyone is altered by a wedding." "That," Alleyn returned, "is often the best reason to do nothing about it." He rose. "Permit me one small request. Until morning, I should like the chapel keys to remain where they are ordinarily kept, and the household to observe its ordinary routine such as it can. In the morning, I shall ask Pemberton to show me those routines. They are the bones upon which a house is hung." Pemberton inclined his head again. "Very good, sir." Alleyn, at the door, paused. "Miss Thornbury, one last thing. The forget-me-nots in Miss Bellwether's hands. Did you gather them?" "No," Daphne said. "I hate them." "Ah," said Alleyn, almost to himself. "Good night." In the corridor's muffled quiet, with the chapel at one end and the drawing-room at the other, the house seemed to close softly about its secret. In the morning, Alleyn told himself, he would ask the servants about their habits. They would not wish to tell him. That too would be telling. They made a small court for grief in the library, where the lamps were lowered and the fire ticked softly in its grate. Pemberton, with an unerring instinct for the grammar of calamity, brought not champagne, but tea in a discreet tray on which the decanter stood like an official prepared to sign necessary papers. Lady Constance sat very straight on the edge of a sofa, hands closed upon a lace handkerchief that had no hope of surviving the night uncrumpled. Miss Thornbury hovered at a respectful distance, and Mr. Hartwell stood with one shoulder to the mantelpiece, eyes lowered, as if his own painting now prosecuted him for prescience. Alleyn did not address them as a group. He had a way of gently extracting one at a time, like fragile books from a crowded shelf, and opening them at the page they were ready to show him. "Mr. Ashworth, if you please," he said, almost apologetically, and led him to a small writing table near the window. Pemberton contrived, without visible transition, to find them there and leave a measured glass of brandy at Richard's elbow. The bridegroom took it and did not drink. "You were the last to see Miss Bellwether alive?" "I suppose so." Richard's voice had the strained steadiness of a man who had put a careful hand upon his emotions and found them likely to buck. After the unveiling there was talk. Dr. Penhaligon's arrival, the usual drift toward dinner. Vivian slipped away. I thought she wanted a breath of air before the first course, as she sometimes did. When her ladyship asked me to fetch her, I tried her sitting room and then, well, the chapel is on the way and the door was open. Was Miss Bellwether in the habit of using the chapel? A slight hesitation. She liked the quiet of it. I couldn't speak to her devotions. She had a fondness for small rituals. The bracelet, for instance. She worried at it when anxious. Forgive me. This is very difficult. The bracelet. Alleyn's voice was mild. A gold chain with little blue flowers. Forget-me-nots. She wore it always. He frowned as if belatedly arriving at a detail that had been present all along. She had it earlier. I remember the sound of it, that small chiming when she moved her hand. "Thank you," said Alleyn, as if he had been offered something rather sensitive and was returning it without damaging the tissue paper. "We shall speak again." He crossed to Lady Constance, who had not allowed herself the weakness of tears. She looked at him with what might have been resentment if it had not been so carefully trained into concern for others. "Inspector, I insist we proceed with the utmost discretion. The staff are loyal, but news spreads like ivy, and there are callers due in the morning who must be managed. I shall not have a scene." "I don't think there will be one," Alleyn said. "May I ask, Lady Constance, whether there was any opposition to the match?" "Opposition?" She considered, adjusted the corner of the handkerchief. Doubts, perhaps, of the sort that accompany any sensible arrangement. They were well suited. "Richard is reliable. Vivian." Her voice caught, and she seemed to revise a sentence halfway through. She had imagination. One manages it in time. Did she confide in you? We spoke as women do, she said, which was both answer and rebuke. She was not one for vulgar dramatics. Miss Thornbury, at the periphery, flinched so slightly that only Alleyn, who had been watching her without appearing to, could have seen it. He inclined his head to Lady Constance and turned to Daphne with a small bow, as if inviting her to choose a dance that would not exhaust her. You and Miss Bellwether were close. Since we were children, Daphne said brightly, and then let the brightness dim, as if it had been too quickly lit. She used to make me laugh and then look dreadfully sorry for it, that sort of person. This evening, oh, Inspector, she was very quiet after the unveiling. I told her the portrait was beautiful, and she said it was too honest for comfort. And then she pinched my hand and asked me not to be silly. Did she speak of tomorrow? Daphne's fingers tightened around the teacup. She said she wished for a small, clean wind. That's how she put it. Something to blow the dust away. A guilty flush climbed into her face. It was only a fancy. We always talked in fancies. Did you notice the bracelet? I always noticed it. It clicked against her cup when she was nervous. Only, yes, after the portrait, I don't think she had it on. Perhaps she tucked it away. She did that sometimes when she didn't want to be read like a book. Thank you, Alleyn said. He let the silence rest long enough for Daphne to escape to the safety of Lady Constance's side. Peregrine Hartwell awaited him without irony. Up close, the artist's composure showed fine cracks, like bloom disturbed on fruit. You paint people as they are, Alleyn said, a dangerous habit. I try to paint what they cannot hide from themselves, Hartwell returned. Miss Bellwether wore sorrow like a halo, not constant, but present. I would not have put it there if it had not been there to be seen. You noticed the bracelet? I did. It annoyed me. The eye rests upon it. I asked her to remove it for one sitting. She did, and then seemed very bare, as if I'd asked her to put down a shield. Today she insisted on wearing it again. She twisted it while we spoke. One of the little flowers had a nick. She said it was her companion in decision. His mouth tightened. I thought she meant the obvious decision, but now I wonder. The chapel door appears in your background. A whim, Hartwell said too quickly. Then, more carefully. She asked me to include a door ajar. She said it gave the picture air. Alleyn let his gaze rest on the painter a moment longer, then inclined his head and turned away. He had the sense of a room that had been rehearsed for years in the art of saying things only to the exact length permitted by custom. Beyond the library door, a footstep sounded with a particular quietness that drew attention to itself. Pemberton, who had not announced himself because he had been everywhere at once, reappeared to trim a wick that did not require trimming. Pemberton, Alleyn said conversationally, we must inconvenience your household a little longer. Dr. Penhaligon will wish to make arrangements. The police photographer will come. I should be grateful for a room where I may write, and a small map of the house if one exists. Certainly, sir, said Pemberton. His expression did not alter, but something in the respectful angle of his head suggested an unspoken reservation, as if the map in question contained an extra corridor known only to those who walked it daily. The morning room will serve you well. There is a plan in the estate book. And afterwards, Alleyn added, as if it had only just occurred to him, I should like to speak with the staff. In their own time. As you wish, sir, Pemberton replied. He did not say, we know much, and we are careful with it. He did not need to. Alleyn watched the door close on the butler's unruffled back and felt, as one sometimes does in an old house, a draught one could not locate. It touched the back of the neck and was gone, leaving only a prickle of intuition. The principals had been elegant in their evasions. The next chapter, he suspected, would be written below stairs. Alleyn did not hurry. The knowledge he sought lay not in declarations, but in the grain of routine. The small habits that, when disturbed, sent faint tremors through a house such as Ashworth Court. The servants' hall, with its scrubbed tables and bright copper pans, held steady under calamity as only well-drilled quarters can. There, duty preserved an order that grief could not displace. "Who keeps the chapel in readiness?" he asked Pemberton, after a silent interval during which the butler's cloth moved steadily over a silver salver that needed no further attention. "The verger function is in Mr. Tolliver's hands, sir," Pemberton replied. "He is the estate carpenter. The chapel comes under his purview, flowers, dusting, the register, and so forth. He answers to Mrs. Hartwell for ceremonial arrangements." Mr. Tolliver appeared in due course, a spare man with careful hands and an air of hushed respect, as if he carried the chapel's stillness about with him. He stood just inside the threshold, hat in hand. "You attend the chapel daily," said Alleyn. "Aye, sir. First thing, and again before dusk when there's to be any service. I sweep, put out the kneelers proper, and see to the vases." Miss Bellwether, begging your pardon, had taken to going in after tea of late. I left the south door on the latch these last days at her request. She said the air was better for her head. "You saw her there yesterday?" "From a distance, sir. About 6:30 by the stable clock. I didn't intrude. She sat on the left, as was her way. Never one for the front pews." "You did not place any flowers on the altar steps last evening?" "No, sir. The arrangements for the morrow were to be done after breakfast today. White roses and myrtle from the conservatory. I'd set no forget-me-nots." He hesitated, his eyes lowering. "If you'll allow, those little blue things in her hands? Not from the beds, sir. Not out in this weather. They'd be from the house or hothouse." Alleyn inclined his head. "Thank you, Mr. Tolliver. That's helpful." He next asked for the head gardener, Mr. Forbes, who arrived smelling faintly of loam and polished leaf. There was steadiness in him. Plants do not teach haste. "For tomorrow's wedding," Alleyn said, "what had you prepared?" "Buttonholes of white rosebud and myrtle, sir. Bouquets for the bridesmaids. Lilies of the valley promised, if the forcing held. And sprays for the pew ends. Nothing blue save a pan of forget-me-nots in the propagation house. Experimenting for spring borders." "Were any taken?" Mr. Forbes looked uneasy. "I missed a pinch yesterday towards evening. A posie's worth, no more. I thought one of the young ladies might have fancied them. There was no written order. We keep a book." He glanced at Pemberton, whose expression, while correct, betrayed a flicker of disapproval at any deviation from system. "Who has access to the propagation house?" "For the most part, only myself and Jenkins, the under-gardener. But if a lady asks, we don't refuse." Miss Thornberry was through in the afternoon. She said she wanted to see the lilies. She had gloves on. Later, a footman came for fresh lemon leaves for the dining arrangements. Alleyn received this with a neutrality that gave nothing away. The path between greenhouse and altar was short enough. It was the intention along it that interested him. He asked for the under-housemaid next. A slight creature, Elsie by name, arrived with spotless apron and the air of someone who had been coached to be neat with words. She kept her eyes on her clasped hands. "You dust the morning room," Alleyn said gently. "Yesterday?" "Yes, sir. After the tea things were cleared. Miss Vivian was there a little while with the French windows open. It was chill. I thought to shut them, but she said no. She liked the air." "Did she write letters?" "A little. She tore one up after. Very little piecey, sir, and put it in the basket. Mrs. Hartwell had the fire lit later, and I never saw it again." "Did you notice anything she carried when she left the room?" "A handkerchief, sir, with blue edging and flowers, and, if it please you not to mind my saying, it seemed she didn't have her bracelet then, the one she always wore with the tiny blue flowers. I remember it because it catches the light when one pours." "Thank you, Elsie." Alleyn dismissed her with a word that sent a faint relief through her shoulders. At last, he sent for the chauffeur. Mr. Briggs had that guarded competence common to good drivers. His responsibilities were concrete, and he preferred them so. He stood squarely, cap in hand. You were about the forecourt yesterday at dusk? Yes, sir. Checking the motor for the early run to the station this morning. There was a telegram expected from town for Mr. Ashworth. I'd thought perhaps a late dash if needed. Didn't come to it. Did you see Miss Bellwether? In the yew walk, sir, going chapel ways. Alone, just on 6:20 by my watch. Mr. Hartwell was smoking under the copper beech about then. Miss Thornbury passed the stables a bit later, looking a mite hurried, if I may say, but ladies do that when they recollect something. Nothing improper. Nothing improper. The phrase hung, decorous as a lace curtain. They were all preserving the proprieties as much for themselves as for the dead girl. But in their careful offerings, Alleyn felt the outline of something that had not kept to the house's rhythms. A posy not ordered, a door left on the latch, a bracelet absent from a wrist where it ought to have shone. He stood for a moment in the quiet of the passage, listening to the small, steady sounds by which a great house reassures itself. The clock in the hall, the tread of a maid on the back stair, the faint clink of china returned to its cupboards. In such rituals lay the pattern of truth. Somewhere within them, a single displaced habit would show its edge. The cancellation of a wedding moves through a house like a change in weather. Breakfast had the faintly apologetic air of a meal that knew itself to be out of place. The white roses stayed where they were, valiant and inappropriate. In the long passage beyond the morning room, a footman removed the silver-ribboned pew cards as one might unpick careful stitching. No one raised their voice. Silence did the work. Alleyn, who distrusted disturbances too noisy for their cause, remained attentive to the small occurrence. He had asked that no one leave the house without quiet notice to Pemberton. He had also asked, with equal quietness, that Vivian's rooms remain undisturbed until he had seen them. Lady Constance, drawn and very correct, acceded. "It shall be done," she had said, and it was. Mrs. Hartwell met him on the landing, hands loosely clasped, her expression sober with a housekeeper's particular grief. "Inspector, I would not have presumed to enter, save that I came to draw down the blinds. One doesn't leave a lady's windows bare at a moment like this." "Quite," said Alleyn. "Thank you." Vivian's room held the faint lavender of well-kept linen and the not-quite-there trace of face powder. The bed was made with a precision that felt, under the circumstances, indecently serene. On the dressing table, a silver-backed brush, a small vial of scent, a glove clip. The place where the charm bracelet would have lain showed as a delicate oval of undisturbed dust. "Inspector," Mrs. Hartwell said after a moment, "there is a thing I ought to tell you at once, before it grows into something it isn't." "Yes?" "I found an envelope beneath the bolster. I did not open it. I brought it to Miss Thornbury." She met his eyes squarely. It was addressed to her. He waited a heartbeat. "When was this?" "This morning, just past 8. "And Miss Thornbury?" "In the orangery," Mrs. Hartwell said, and hesitated. "She appeared, overcome. The gardener's boy fetched water. No fuss was made." In the orangery's tempered warmth, Alleyn found Daphne seated on a wicker chair with a shawl around her shoulders, very pale and very composed in the style of a young woman who has decided to be brave. The envelope lay on a small table at her elbow. It had already been opened, the flap neatly lifted by a letter knife. The paper within was a single typed sheet. "May I?" he asked. She inclined her head. "Of course." The type was uneven, the sort of faint, stuttering impression common to machines used more for lists and invitations than for indulgence. The language was spare. "Daphne, forgive me. I am tired. Do not grieve for me. The door stands ajar. You will understand." There was no signature, but the delicate forget-me-not pressed flat between paper and fold argued authorship as persuasively as any name. The flower, Alleyn thought, could be placed by anyone who had observed Vivian's habits. The phrase, "the door stands ajar," echoed, almost too neatly, the penciled note in the chapel prayer book and the image in Hartwell's portrait. It had the air of a line used once and then used again, as if someone were playing variations on a theme. "Who brought this to you?" he asked. "Mrs. Hartwell. She said she found it under Vivian's pillow." Daphne's voice was very quiet. "Please do not be angry with her. It seemed kinder that I should read it first." "I'm not angry with anyone," Alleyn said, "only with circumstance." He set the letter down, mindful of its fragility. "Do you know this typewriting?" "The library has a machine," Daphne said after a moment. "Richard uses it for estate letters when he is here. Lady Constance detests it. She says the click is unmusical." "Quite. Have you noticed anyone else using it?" "Mr. Hartwell borrowed it yesterday afternoon to write a note to his London framer." She folded the shawl edge between forefinger and thumb, thinking. "He asked Pemberton for paper. And you?" "I?" She coloured faintly. "No." Pemberton, summoned softly, confirmed the machine's existence with his usual economy. "A Remington portable, Inspector. It lives in the library cupboard. Mr. Hartwell did request it around 4. I took it in myself." He returned it before tea. "May I see it?" It came, discreetly bundled, along with a drawer of typed invitations and a selection of ribbons in their metal tins. The uppercase R snagged slightly. The E wore thin at its top bar. The letter on the table showed the same frailties. "It could be the library machine," Alleyn said, as if to himself. "It could also be any of a dozen similar Remingtons within a 20-mile radius. We shall, however, not leave this one to chance." "Inspector," Pemberton said, an infinitesimal pause preceding the information, "Mr. Hartwell is not in his room. He went out before breakfast. He left word that he was walking to the village to send a cable. He did not wish to trouble the house telephone." "Did he take his portfolio?" "No, sir." Alleyn looked at the flower pressed into the letter and at the young woman seated so still beneath the glimmering leaves. The air in the orangery held the faint bitter of orange peel. A second disturbance had moved through Ashworth Court with all the noise of a cat's tread, a note that arranged itself as comfort, and an absence that was not yet a disappearance, but could, with time, become one. "Thank you," he said to Daphne, rising. "I shall ask you to keep this letter safe a little longer. We will try to make its meaning serve the living as well as it has honored the dead." Outside, somewhere in the direction of the village, a rook called once, a harsh single note in a bright morning. Alleyn felt his thoughts settling, not to certainty, but to a fine dust that would soon show the track of whoever had moved most recently through this very proper house. It was late afternoon, that hour when rooms turn contemplative and furniture seems to draw breath. In the long library at Ashworth Court, the motes hung visibly in a slant of pale sun, and Inspector Alleyn stood very still, letting them settle. He had learned long ago that the mind, if not harried, arranged its own cards and laid them quietly on the green baize. He did not yet think in proofs. He thought in textures, the formal tenderness of the chapel arrangement, the small violent fact of the torn bracelet, the gardener's offended sense of order over the uprooted forget-me-nots, the typewriter with its faintly pinched E and a recalcitrant R, the doctor-uncle's letter tucked beneath the blotter like a confession that had lost courage at the last moment, and above all, the portrait's ajar door, now a recurring symbol, as if Vivian herself had tilted some threshold and stood a moment upon it, neither in nor out. Dr. Marcus Bellwether had submitted to a brief, careful conversation in the morning room, speaking with a physician's economy and a relation's unease. He was pale from travel. His hands, long and clean, did not fidget, but the veins upon them were too pronounced. "She wrote of irregularities," he said, "matters in her mother's line that had been arranged into a respectable myth. She had found a seam and picked at it. She was very scrupulous, Inspector. She did not enjoy ease bought at the cost of a lie. You urged silence, Alleyn said gently. I urged delay, Dr. Bellwether corrected. There are ways to set a bone without shattering it further. She feared the wedding would fix the falsehood in place. I asked for a fortnight. I see now that time is a treacherous prescription. He did not over-protest. He did not invoke professions or indignations. He accepted, with a kind of bleak courtesy, that his advice might have driven events, even if he had not wished it. Alleyn noted it and let it rest. He took himself next to the library desk. The Remington sat under its oilcloth cover like an obedient spaniel. He lifted the cover and turned the platen. The ribbon was fresh. The carbon papers in the drawer were neatly stacked. Too neatly. A corner sheet bore the faint ghost of lines typed and removed. A few phrases impressed backward, no more than fragments. Alleyn did not shade them with pencil or send for a microscope. He only read what could be read by patience. A salutation, my dear. And later a phrase, best to make it seem. And a little further on, no distress. He did not smile. The thin E and the grudging R had stamped their signatures upon the faintness. He replaced everything as it had been. It would do, later. The butler's footfall came and went along the corridor with the tact of a man who moves air for a living. From the terrace, one heard the gardener speaking to his boy in undertones about cold frames and frost. The house continued its customary rituals, as houses will do even while death sits in the chapel like a visiting bishop. Alleyn considered means. Cyanide does not arrive by miracle. It travels in cup or lozenge or bottle. Vivian had not drunk in the chapel. The almond scent had lingered there, but there had been no glass. Tea, then, or a sweet, or a pill disguised as remedy. The scent bottle on her desk remained full and innocent. The tea service on the tray had been washed by the time he asked to see it. Washed, because that is what one does in a good house. He did not criticize. Both guilt and innocence may present as impeccable housekeeping. He walked through the French windows onto the west terrace and let the autumn air file the edge of his thoughts. From this angle, the chapel's small apse and leaded windows were visible across the lawn, modest and assured. He could imagine Vivian's path at 6:30, the measured tread of someone who obeys duty while arguing with it, her hand lifting from habit to touch a bracelet suddenly absent, her mind precise and painfully exacting, deciding not to postpone the moral arithmetic any longer. Whether she had walked to comfort or to judgment, someone had arranged that she should arrive unable to argue either way. So, not a crime of heat, not a brute act. A mind had been at work, a mind that understood her scruples and could make use of them. He thought of Richard's steadied voice and quickness to declare business irrelevant, of Lady Constance's unblemished propriety, a kind of armor too polished to show dents, of Miss Thornbury's effortful brightness set like enamel over something less festive, of Hartwell's parted veil, the small vanity of a man who knows he has seen too much and must make a virtue of it. To all of them he had said very little. In such houses, silence yields more readily than pressure. He would not accuse, he would invite, he would ask them to do what they did best: assemble, observe, behave. In their own observation, her masks slipped. He returned to the library and wrote 2 short notes, neither of them on the Remington. One requested that the intimate circle dine early and en famille in the small dining room, without the larger company and without any of the ceremonial wines that a bereaved household might otherwise press upon sorrow. The other asked Mr. Hartwell, with courtesy, to bring his preliminary sketches to the drawing-room after dinner. He sealed both, rang once for Pemberton, and watched the butler's eyes acknowledge without inquiry. There was, as yet, nothing to proclaim, but the dust had settled enough to show the outline of a shape upon the table. If he were right, it would be kinder, so far as kindness was possible, to set the pieces down gently and allow the truth to appear almost of its own accord. Toward evening, the house darkened by degrees. The portrait, waiting in its place, seemed to gather shadow and intention. Alleyn, passing it, inclined his head to the painted bride with a private apology for the work still ahead. By late afternoon, the house had fallen into that particular quiet that follows an upheaval. Footsteps muted in corridors, voices low by communal consent, a sense of time moving without daring to draw attention to itself. Alleyn, who had been listening all day to words shaped for him with care, allowed silence to work instead. He took his solitary circuit, chapel, library, conservatory path, and back again by the west terrace where the urns held geraniums already giving up their color to the season. The pattern, once so stubbornly resistant, began to settle with the measured patience of ash in a high glass. There was the body, composed as though for benediction. There were the forget-me-nots, hurriedly pulled yet reverently placed. There was the missing bracelet, its enamel bright as a child's toy and torn away with an abruptness out of keeping with the rest. There was a letter hidden under a blotter when another, of foreign paper, had been consigned at the lady's request to the grate. There was, too, a portable typewriter which had, inconveniently, shifted position when no one had needed it to move. He paused at the library window and watched the groundsmen raking leaves into discreet mounds. The gardener's testimony revisited him. Roots and all, haste in the garden, thought in the chapel. The two behaviors could belong to the same hand, or else to two hands, uneasy in their choreography, the one impulsive, the other fastidious. He could not yet decide which explanation was more terrible. In the chapel, he had measured, without seeming to measure, the distance between the kneeling marks and the step where she was laid. A taller person, not vastly, but enough. Richard was taller, Hartwell also. Pemberton, in his starched dignity, had that long servant's reach. Dr. Marcus Bellwether, new arrived and hollowed by travel, was of a height nearer to the girl's own. These were no more than mental notches against a door frame, but they were there. He took from his pocketbook the faint pencil copy he had made of Vivian's marginalia. The door stands ajar, and held it beneath the library lamp. The handwriting was delicate, consistent, without any of the frantic slant he had seen in letters written under immediate distress. Considered, then, a thought reached and placed, not a cry. Yet Mrs. Hartwell's recollection of the earlier letter, paleness, trembling, the wish for fire, belonged to a different state of mind. Two letters, two moods, two movements in a piece that had concluded too soon. Dr. Penhaligon, that competent man, had given the expected phrase, bitter almonds. Prussic acid, impeccably swift and treacherously available to those who knew where to look. The garden shed might yield a fumigant locked away for orchard pests. A studio might harbor chemicals used for fixing photographs or cleaning brushes. A household this size could conjure any number of legitimate pretexts for dangerous substances. If there had been a container, it had been removed. He was not surprised. Whoever had staged that altar would not have left a bottle like a vulgar stage property on the steps. The bracelet bothered him more than any bottle. He saw again Vivian's nervous fingers turning the tiny flowers, a childish talisman made elegant by goldsmith's art. The chip of blue enamel on the flagstones, he had sealed it in an envelope with no word to anyone, had the look of a fragment from the charm nearest a discreet hinge. Forget-me-nots, a hinge, an interior, a place to hide something flat and precious, a miniature, a folded scrap, a key. He did not permit the speculation to harden into certainty, but he let it lodge. Of the people, Richard's prompt assumption of practical duties, his brisk concern for arrangements, admirable on the surface, perhaps necessary, but the effect was of a man pushing his shock ahead of him as one might roll a rug over a stain. Lady Constance wore her grief like full mourning, appropriate, exact, leaving no edges visible. Miss Thornbury's brightness had gone to ground, leaving behind an honesty that betrayed itself in small delays before simple answers. Peregrine Hartwell, all considerate tact, carried the self-accusation of an artist who has seen too much and said it on canvas. Pemberton and Mrs. Hartwell moved with that disciplined discretion which in other contexts made them admirable. To Allen's ear, it made their omissions more instructive than their statements. As for Dr. Marcus Bellwether, there was genuine anguish there, and something of the guilty man who arrives late to prevent a calamity and suspects he might have hastened it by writing at all. He wrote 2 lines to Fox and left them for posting with the evening bag. A quiet request for a chemical man to come down discreetly and for a look into Dr. Marcus Bellwether's bona fides, licensure, postings, any whisper of professional scandal that might have sent him abroad for reasons other than opportunity. It was not distrust. It was the habit of clearing mist from a glass. Then he closed the blotter, replaced the Remington's cover precisely as Pemberton would have had it, and let his hand rest for a moment on the smooth bakelite keys. The thinness at the upper curve of the E, the catch in the R. He would know those again if he saw them impressed upon paper. When he rose, he had the shape of a conversation in mind, quiet, without audience, preferably in a place where the wind took words and left only intention. No accusations, merely the suggestion that 2 people had met at the chapel by arrangement, and that one of them now had a bracelet in their keeping which did not belong to them. He did not yet know to which person he would speak first. He would let the house tell him. It had been speaking all day. At the door he paused, listening to the calm of Ashworth Court secure itself for evening. The next movement would require delicacy. A small gathering, perhaps, or simply a walk along the U-path with one of those whose names had taken on weight in his mind. He was ready to let the dust of his intuition lie exactly where it had fallen, and to see who disturbed it when he opened the door. Alleyn requested the small blue saloon rather than the grand drawing-room. Its intimacy suited the tenor of what he intended. Not a display, but a conversation. The lamps were shaded. The curtains stood ajar upon a slate-colored afternoon. Outside, the cedars wrote dark hieroglyphs against a paling sky. Within, the sound was only the small domestic murmur of an old house continuing, with quiet obstinacy, to be itself. He began, as he often did, with courtesy. "Mr. Hartwell," he said when the painter entered, "you have a talent for discernment. I wonder whether you would lend it to me for a moment." Hartwell stood by the mantel, slender and self-contained, his hands clasped as though to contain their restlessness. "If I can be of use, Inspector." "You walked toward the chapel yesterday evening," Alleyn said mildly. "The chauffeur noticed your purposefulness. Was there an appointment?" Hartwell's gaze did not waver. "Miss Bellwether asked me to look at the chapel light for a possible background alteration. I went to see whether the idea had merit." "And did you find merit?" "A dreadful kind," the painter replied after the smallest of pauses. "I saw the last of the evening light, and then others arrived." He glanced down. "I did not speak because I saw there was nothing useful to say." Alleyn regarded him. "You knew her well enough to paint her truthfully." "I saw she was in conflict," Hartwell said. "That is not knowledge. It is observation, and if you ask whether I cared, I will not pretend indifference. But I did not harm her." "Did you take forget-me-nots from the frames?" A faint smile. "Private, almost ashamed. I picked flowers for her once, at her request a week ago. Yesterday, no." He dismissed the painter with a word of thanks and sent for Miss Thornbury. Daphne entered with the brave schoolroom brightness of a woman performing a familiar exercise. She sat, folded her hands, and looked at him steadily. "You were in the conservatory yesterday," Alleyn said. "Yes," she said. "I am absurdly fond of lilies." "And forget-me-nots?" Her composure faltered. "Vivian liked them. I never have. They are sentimental little things." "Yet useful," Alleyn murmured, "for a message." She stared. "What do you mean?" That some flowers are chosen because they say what one does not dare to write. He let the sentence settle, watched its effect. She made no sound, but her glance dropped to her clasped fingers, and something in her stillness acknowledged the wound. "I did not poison her," she said presently. "If there is anything you must suspect me of, it is only that I envied her." She rose as if the admission had cost her, and allowed him to dismiss her with a nod. Richard came last. He stood near the French window, the light striking his spectacles. "You will forgive directness," Alleyn said. "You were the first to send word from the chapel. You knew of Miss Bellwether's habit of going there. You also knew, through the household, of her choice of flowers." Richard's mouth tightened. "Inspector, the house is full of knowledge. One swims in it." "Quite. A typewriter that shifts its R and thins its E swims in it too. It moves when no one is looking." Richard's gaze flickered. "You imply forgery." "I imply opportunity." Alleyn spoke without heat. "Dr. Bellwether tells me there were family matters that required tact. Your engagement was conducted with a degree of practicality not uncommon in our world. A practical man sometimes writes what cannot be said aloud," Richard said after a moment. "I wrote nothing to her that she did not already know." "Then you will not object," Alleyn returned, "if I ask Pemberton to bring the machine to my care." Richard's shoulders lifted and settled, a gesture of consent or surrender. It was difficult to tell which. When they were gone, Alleyn rang for Pemberton and asked that the household, the small circle most immediately concerned, be invited to the Blue Saloon. Lady Constance came, upright and pale. Dr. Bellwether with his tired clarity. Hartwell composed. Miss Thornbury quiet. Richard contained. Mrs. Hartwell and Pemberton steady as seasoned oak. Alleyn did not sit. He stood by the small writing table where a single lamp made an island of light. "Forgive the liberty," he said softly. "I prefer not to perform the next part of my duty in any tone but the civil one this house deserves. I have learned a few things. They are simple matters of habit and the slight noises departure makes when it breaks a routine. Miss Bellwether visited the chapel regularly. She liked forget-me-nots. She had a prayer book not of the chapel's issue. She wore a bracelet that was not merely ornament." He let the words rest, watched the minute adjustments, Richard's hand to his spectacles, Lady Constance's fingers tightening on her handkerchief, Miss Thornbury's lip catching at a tooth. Silence, a precise instrument, did its work. "The bracelet," Alleyn continued, "was torn away. A small blue fragment lay near her shoulder. Whoever removed it did so in haste, and I think in fear. It is possible the bracelet mattered almost as much as her death." He looked from one to the other. "I do not propose at this moment to say more. I prefer to offer a courtesy. If the bracelet were returned to this table before dinner, we might dispense with certain public inconveniences. If it is not, I must proceed." No one spoke. Dr. Bellwether's eyes met Alleyn's. There was pain in them, but also a certain tired relief, as of a man who sees an inevitable step taken at last. "I shall be in the chapel for half an hour," Alleyn said. "Pemberton will leave the door open. The lamp will remain lit." He inclined his head, and the company rose as if concluding a visit. They drifted away with the careful, graceful movements of people who know the value of appearances, even in extremity. Alleyn walked out alone into the narrowing light. The cedars were black now. The gravel gave a dry, courteous crunch underfoot. Behind him, in the Blue Saloon, a small pool of lamplight waited upon a single object to be laid within it. He did not look back. He entered the chapel, where the stones remembered what had happened and did not say it aloud. He sat in the third pew on the left, where she had sat, and let the silence come down like dust. They gathered in the small morning room at Alleyn's request, the lamps shaded, the curtains half drawn, the air tempered by the autumn evening that pressed its cool cheek against the panes. There were no theatrics here, only people accustomed to civility, brought to a pause before the necessity of truth. Lady Constance sat quite straight, her hands closed upon each other. Richard stood by the mantel-shelf, not touching it. Miss Thornbury occupied the chair nearest the door, as if ready to flee and yet too loyal to do so. Peregrine Hartwell stood a pace behind them all, as one might stand before a painting he had completed and could not alter. Dr. Marcus Bellwether had arrived to these rooms as to a sick-bed and remained quiet, attentive, grave. Alleyn did not take the central place. He stood by the writing desk, where the edge of the blotter still showed the faint impression of a folded letter. His tone, when he began, held neither triumph nor apology. "We have walked," he said, "some little way into Miss Bellwether's private country. What we find there is not disorder, but an arrangement too careful to be natural. She did not die where she fell. She was placed with tenderness. The flowers were chosen as she liked them. The scene was not cruelty, but a ceremony." No one spoke. The clock on the chimney-piece made a small domestic sound. "Several details," Alleyn went on, "helped us to that ceremony's architect. Mr. Tolliver did not lay forget-me-nots on the altar yesterday. Mr. Forbes can tell us that enough blooms were hastily pulled, roots and all, from his frames near dusk. Miss Thornbury, you were among the flowers in the afternoon. Mr. Hartwell, you were there later, sketching the light." Daphne looked up, startled. Yes, Inspector, but I took nothing." Alleyn inclined his head. "It is not you I'm thinking of. Mr. Briggs saw Miss Bellwether pass the stable-yard toward the chapel at 6:30. 10 minutes later, Mr. Hartwell went by the same way with purpose. The chapel shows the marks of a tall person kneeling longer than grief requires, and in that place, upon the stone, we found a sliver of blue, enamel." Richard stirred. Hartwell's face did not. "At first," Alleyn said, "I thought it from Miss Bellwether's bracelet. The little charms were blue and the bracelet is missing. But the fragment will not match any setting of that piece. It does, however, answer to an old mend on one of your cufflinks, Mr. Hartwell." He held out the tiny shard between finger and thumb. Hartwell glanced at his cuff. The right link, a modest oval ringed in blue, showed a crescent bite where enamel should have been. He made no move to look closer. Dr. Marcus spoke for the first time, his voice low. "Inspector, the letter you found under the blotter, the one bearing my name, I did not write it. I never sign myself your devoted servant to my niece, nor do I use that paper. She told me, in a hand I know, something that distressed her. I urged her to keep counsel until I could advise her. I arrived too late." Lady Constance shut her eyes briefly. Alleyn's glance moved to the typewriter cupboard. "A letter meant to reassure might be forged to delay a crisis," he said, almost to himself. "We know the Remington was borrowed yesterday afternoon and moved again later, when it should not have been. The machine has a particular way with its E and a reluctance over R. One need not be a trained forger if one can draft and draw and make a shape pass for something else." Hartwell lifted his gaze to Alleyn's. "You are very gentle, Inspector." "It seems required," Alleyn said. A silence opened in which denial might easily have been set. No one offered it. Hartwell's hands, steady and fine, reached to his breast pocket and brought out a small parcel wrapped in tissue. He laid it upon the writing desk and unfolded it with the care of a restorer. The forget-me-not bracelet lay there, one charm crushed, the clasp broken as if torn free in haste. "I meant," he said, and the weariness in his voice was of a man who has stood too long, to return it. She had left it with me after the last sitting. The clasp caught at her sleeve, and I promised to have it mended in London. Yesterday, when I understood she would not be carried by the tide that was arranged for her, I thought it better she should not wear a token of the past at the last. I dropped the link at the chapel when I moved her hands. I had not noticed. Lady Constance's fan, untouched all evening, trembled in her lap. Mr. Hartwell, she said very quietly, what did you do? What I could to make an ugly thing less ugly, he answered. She would not be party to a deception. She had a courage that... He stopped. I did not argue well. It is an artist's fault to believe in forms, that the right composition can balance a canvas and the right arrangement steady a life. I had the means to make it swift, from a studio drawer, not a dispensary. He looked at Alleyn. I know what cyanide is. Daphne made a small sound, half protest, half pity. Richard stared at the bracelet as if it represented arithmetic gone suddenly wrong. Alleyn did not move. You gave it to her, he said, neither accusing nor absolving. She took it because I told her it would be quiet, Hartwell answered. Blame me for the words, the persuasion, the staging, all of it. She had chosen to speak the truth. I chose something else. Dr. Marcus's face was set, but he bowed his head. My poor child, he said, and whether he meant Vivian or the man before him, no one asked. Thank you, Alleyn said. We will not make a spectacle. Mr. Hartwell, will you come with me now? There are formalities. We shall contrive them without noise. Hartwell lifted the tissue around the bracelet and folded it shut, not to conceal it, but to keep it from the air. Yes, he said, if you please. They went out together with the quiet of men leaving a theater by a side door, not to break the spell, but because it has done its work. In the room they left behind, the clock resumed its comfortable ticking, and Miss Thornberry began at last, and very softly, to cry. The house received the news as great houses do, with a stillness that was not silence so much as a decision. By mid-morning the air had acquired the peculiar clarity that follows a storm. Doors seemed to close more gently. Footfalls grew softer, and the household routine resumed with an almost ceremonial correctness, as if form itself could steady those for whom certainty had slipped. Inspector Alleyn sat in the library, with the French windows slightly ajar on the last of the autumn roses. The little objects that befitted a country gentleman's life lay in their accustomed places. A silver-topped inkstand, a neat stack of estate correspondence, a riding crop balanced across a chair back by some forgotten hand. On the blotter, where a man habitually set his signature to documents of consequence, lay the small blue enameled bracelet. Its clasp was broken. A petal of forget-me-not enamel had been sheared away. Within the tiny locket, lately prized open by careful fingers, a faint pencil inscription had been preserved by chance and sentiment. To V, from M, Geneva. Under it, a date that made nonsense of certain family stories. Richard Ashworth entered without ceremony and closed the door himself. The habit of command had left his face. What remained was a curious lightness, as if a burden, however terrible, had chosen him at last, and he had elected to carry it decently. He looked not at Alleyn first, but at the river of ink on the blotter, then at the bracelet. You will prefer the formalities to be quiet, Alleyn said, as if remarking on the weather. Yes, Richard answered, for my mother's sake. There was no bluster. Those who perform well under strain sometimes do so because they lack imagination, others because they possess too much. Richard's composure was of the latter sort. He sat and, in the very act of sitting, seemed to put away the past 24 hours and consider, with a businessman's efficiency, the next. I made a foolish calculation, he said. Foolish because I mistook the appearance of necessity for necessity itself. She meant to postpone, not destroy. It is, I think, the difference between honor and fear. Alleyn did not contradict him. The distinctions men make for themselves at such moments are their own to keep. He touched, instead, upon the facts as one sets forth a chess position that has reached its inevitable end. The cyanide, he said, from the gunroom press. Your estate books show an order last month. Greenhouse fumigant. The key was in your possession." Richard inclined his head. "The bouquet," Alleyn continued very gently, "pulled with the roots by a man who has not knelt in a cold frame in his life, and the kneeling on the altar steps. A tall man, unfamiliar with the posture and holding it too long. You arranged her as carefully as you run your ledgers. It was, if you will forgive me, a dreadful courtesy." Richard's hand, opening on the arm of the chair, closed again. "It was meant to confer dignity," he said, half to himself. "One does harm and seeks to mend it with forms." "The typewriter," Alleyn said. "You moved it after. The note for Tolliver, asking that the chapel be left open, written in your style, but the bitten R and the thin E. It was intended to suggest that she had prepared herself for a solitary vigil. And the bracelet, removed because the inscription, if found immediately, would have pointed too directly to what she had newly learnt and whom she had consulted." Richard's gaze did not flicker. "I shall make my statement. You need not produce the particulars to my mother. Lady Constance came when sent for, and it was to her credit that she neither pleaded nor protested. She stood by the writing table and looked at the little blue forget-me-nots. 'I shall not require to know the details,' she said to Alleyn, and then, to her son, 'You will go now. It will be better for all if you go now.' Dr. Marcus Bellwether asked for a few minutes and was given them. He came out of the library with the grave reticence of a physician leaving a sick room where there is nothing to be done but sit with the family. 'I told him,' he said to Alleyn, 'that the truth she discovered would have altered nothing that mattered. Illegitimacy is a legal word, love, a human one. He said he knew that now and had known it, perhaps, all along.' Pemberton supervised the small necessities of departure with the same unassailable propriety with which he served champagne at an engagement toast. The car came to the portico without fuss. A corridor clock struck the quarter hour in a tone as civilized as any conversation at Ashworth Court had ever been. Richard paused at the top of the steps and looked once toward the chapel, as if to fix it in his mind. Then he went down and got into the car, and if his hand trembled as he closed the door, the tremor belonged to no one but himself. There were no villagers gathered, no curious faces at the windows. It had been arranged as he wished, efficiently, almost kindly. The house, having seen the thing through, exhaled. In the conservatory, Mr. Forbes reset tiny clumps of forget-me-nots in their trays with a gardener's stubborn faith that what is uprooted can, with patience, be coaxed to live again. In the servants' hall, Mrs. Hartwell poured tea with a steadiness that comforted more than words. Lady Constance, after a time, went upstairs and removed her pearls, laying them on velvet as if they, too, had become unexpectedly heavy. Alleyn remained in the library a little while longer. He replaced the bracelet in its evidence envelope and wrote, in his neat hand, the date and hour. Through the open window the garden made its quiet case for continuity. There would be statements, and then London, and then the long, slow machinery of consequence. He closed the window gently against a rising draught and, for a moment, let his hand rest on the sill. Somewhere in the house, a door clicked softly into place. The formal part was done. What lingered, the image of a girl who had sought to tell the truth and of a man who had chosen form over courage, would require a different kind of accounting, and in that arithmetic the totals rarely balance. He turned toward the corridor, where the light had begun to thin, and went to find Lady Constance. There were particulars to settle. There is always, after the act is recognized and named, the smaller duty of learning how to live with it. Alleyn asked for a small assembly in the library, as dusk thinned the edges of the lawns. Lamps were lit, their shades casting discreet halos that did not so much banish shadows as domesticate them. Lady Constance sat very straight, one hand upon the arm of her chair, the other resting on a folded handkerchief. Mr. Hartwell stood by the mantel, his gaze fixed upon nothing in particular. Miss Thornbury occupied a low seat and kept her eyes upon the rug's careful geometry, as if its pattern might impose order upon the last 2 days. Dr. Marcus Bellwether, grey with travel and grief, remained near the window, his profile a study in contained distress. Richard Ashworth, impeccable as ever, stood beside the writing table and did not remove his spectacles. "I shall try," Alleyn said, with a courtesy that did not soften the steel beneath, "to put this as plainly and as gently as possible." He began with the smallest things. The bouquet that had no business carrying its roots into a chapel. The kneeling marks, too long, too deliberate, for a scene of sudden collapse. The prayer book tucked beneath the altar, as one tucks away a talisman. He spoke of the scent in the chapel's air, almond faint and wrong, for a place whose natural perfume was in candle wax and stone. "Prussic acid," he said, and saw Dr. Marcus tilt his head in bleak assent. Vivian had formed a ritual of quiet, Alleyn went on. Someone who loved her, or who wished to be thought to love her, took pains to preserve that ritual even while ending her life. Hartwell drew a breath. "Inspector, if you mean to suggest that." "I suggest only that you followed her toward the chapel," Alleyn replied, mild as a magistrate's nod. "You may thank the chauffeur for observing your route. But you did not kill her. You found her, or found her dying, and your instincts, being those of a man who arranges beauty for a living, did some of the rest. You fetched the flowers, as you thought she would have liked them." He lifted a hand when Hartwell started. "A decent impulse, and an unfortunate one, but not murder." Hartwell's shoulders seemed to loosen around a held breath. It was Miss Thornbury, unexpectedly, who made a small sound, half relief and half something darker. "Miss Thornbury," Alleyn said, turning to her as though continuing an old conversation. "You were in the propagation frames yesterday. The gardener remembers. You gathered nothing. You are not the hand that tore those flowers up by their roots." He let the mercy settle before adding, "You did, however, know far more than you told me. Your friend confided something you found unbearable." Her reticence cracked at last. "She meant to stop the wedding," she said, in a voice that seemed to belong to the schoolroom. "But she wished to do so privately, without humiliation for anyone. She said there was a truth, a dreadful truth, that could not stand in a church. I begged her to tell Richard at once. She promised she would." Alleyn inclined his head. "She did not keep that promise. Or rather," he corrected himself, "she was prevented." He set down the next card with delicate exactitude. "The letter found under Miss Bellwether's blotter, your devoted servant, Dr. M. Bellwether. An uncle does not, in my experience, sign himself so to his niece. Dr. Marcus has confirmed he wrote no such thing. It was meant to quiet her, to assure her that help was coming, and so to buy, what? A fortnight." Richard did not move. He did, however, remove his spectacles and begin, meticulously, to polish them. The gesture had, Alleyn thought, become his way of performing composure. There is a typewriter in this house whose uppercase R sticks and whose E is faint at the top. Pemberton noticed it had been moved after the tragedy. Someone, in the agitation of that night, thought to destroy a draft. He forgot the ribbon will keep its ghosts. Lady Constance's hand tightened on the handkerchief. "Mr. Alleyn." "Just so," Alleyn agreed. "I'm nearly done." He let his glance fall, briefly and without triumph, upon Richard. "There remains the missing bracelet, a pretty thing, forget-me-nots in blue enamel." "It was wrenched away." The chip near her shoulder tells that story well enough. The charm opened. Inside, a miniature, 2 figures, a young officer of the Ashworth line and a very young woman with an infant. Pemberton, in a manner entirely proper to his position and history here, put that miniature into my hands this morning. Silence, deep and breathable, filled the room. The truth Miss Bellwether had uncovered, Alleyn said, was of a kind that undoes lives politely. It appears your father, Mr. Ashworth, was generous in his affections before his marriage, and Miss Bellwether's mother was among those so distinguished. There are registers abroad that record a hasty ceremony later annulled, or allowed to vanish in the fog of post-war irregularities. Dr. Marcus had begun to piece this together. He urged secrecy until facts could be established. Miss Bellwether, having the kind of moral scruples some might call inconvenient, could not marry you while uncertain whether she was, in fact, your sister. Half, Richard said, and then, after an interval of admirable emptiness, half-sister. If you like, Alleyn returned, courteous still. You had much to lose. Your house, your name, your future in public life. You also had access, through your firms, to cyanides employed in plating and extraction. You sent her a letter in her uncle's hand to buy days you did not have. And then, when she spoke of ending the matter, you ended it for her with what you told yourself was kindness. You arranged her gently. You removed the bracelet because it told too much truth in too little space. You believed, I dare say, that this would bury the scandal with her. Richard placed his spectacles carefully upon the table. When he spoke, it was to Dr. Marcus. I found her in the chapel, he said, and the past tense came more easily now. She had chosen that place for all her thinking. I brought the flowers because she liked them there. It was meant to be dignified. Dr. Marcus looked as a man looks who has given too much advice too late. Lady Constance, after a moment, rose and crossed to the bell-pull, then let her hand fall from it again. She did not ring. "Inspector," she said, "is this to be public?" Alleyn's reply was very gentle. "It is to be lawful, my lady." He turned to Richard as one might to a promising pupil whose exercise ends in error. "If you wish to walk with me to the chapel, we will go now. Superintendent Fox will meet us at the gate. There will be no disturbance." Richard picked up his spectacles, and for the first time his fingers trembled. "I should like," he said, "to put out the candles if they are still burning." "Of course," Alleyn said. They went out together. Miss Thornbury put her face in her hands and did not weep. Mr. Hartwell, quite white, moved to steady Lady Constance, though she had not asked it. Pemberton, who had entered silently at some point, removed the empty tea tray with a precision that restored dignity to small things. Later, alone for a moment in the chapel's cool air, Alleyn stood where the kneeling marks had been and looked toward the shadowed door. The posted notice of no morning service lay on the lectern with restrained finality. In the side light, the spray of forget-me-nots had begun to wilt, their blue deepening as if to remember itself. He thought, not without compassion, that in certain houses the truth was a trespass like any other, and doors were kept ajar not for escape but for air. He shut the chapel door softly behind him